You read about this work in last night's homework, and I talked about it some in my previous podcast. It's not a College Board required work, but it is a very important transitional work in the course, because here we see the notion of kingship in Mesopotamia undergoing a significant shift. The Akkadian king has godlike qualities that Sumerian rulers did not, and his close association with the gods is reinforced by the horns he wears. That's a symbol of the gods, and by the stars or suns that shine down on him, which indicate that he has the favor of the heavens. We also see our old friend's hierarchical scale and naked, beaten enemies. Before I finish up our forced march through 2,000 years of Mesopotamian history in 2 days, let me note that certain symbols of rule show up time and again, not only in the art of this culture, but in others as well. We've talked before about the significance of bulls. The figure on the left is Sumerian, part of a lyre or a musical instrument. The lion comes from Babylon's Ishtar Gate, which is another famous work that the College Board left off the list. Suns or stars and horns are, as I just said, symbols of divinity or godly favor. So after the Akkadians are conquered by a mountain tribe, the city-states of Sumer enjoyed a temporary resurgence. And then they in turn were conquered and unified by one of the city-states, Babylon. Just to make matters confusing, there is another Babylonian empire about 1,000 years later, sometimes referred to as Neo-Babylonian. That's the culture that erects the Ishtar Gate. But it's the first Babylon that's important for our purposes, because this culture produced one of the most important works, not only of art, but of historical record, the Stele of Hammurabi. And of course, it's one of our required works. Now, I'm not going to just repeat all of the information from the Khan Academy video. I trust you all watched it. So instead, let's hear from you. How does this stele reinforce the power and authority of the king? Remember, that's one of the big themes of this unit. Well, pretty clearly the king is hanging out with the sun god. Shamash is willing to admit Hammurabi into his godly presence, and that in itself indicates the king's power and authority. And while Hammurabi raises and crosses his hands in a gesture of respect for the god, and while Hammurabi stands while the god sits, still Hammurabi is not portrayed as much smaller than the god himself. A little smaller, but not the kind of size difference that we saw, for example, between King Narmer and his officials or Naram Sin and his soldiers. And what is the god handing to Hammurabi? Well, he's handing Hammurabi a rod or scepter and a ring. These are still symbols of rule, but they are also, in this case, connected to the idea that Hammurabi is building a kingdom by promulgating laws. These are construction images. So the rod was used in building as a unit of measurement, and the ring actually signifies a rope used in construction. So in essence, the god is handing over the power and the tools to build a social order and to measure people's lives. That is, to render judgment. So here's a good vocabulary word to know: investiture. The stele represents Hammurabi's investiture. American presidents have an inauguration, which is a kind of investiture, when they take an oath of office and become president. Here, Hammurabi is essentially taking an oath directly from the god. The stele also, of course, lists Hammurabi's famous and rather harsh laws. You saw a few of these in your reading, including the famous an eye for an eye. Note that the law, as well as the favor of the gods, is seen as a sign of Hammurabi's power and indication of his right to rule. He is the king who imposes and enforces order. And I've got just some of the cuneiform here. I wasn't able to find a section that included a translation, which would have been fun. Maybe one of you can. So we've talked about hieratic scale or hierarchy of scale, and we see that Shamash is a little, though not a lot, bigger than Hammurabi. What other stylistic devices or conventions can you observe in this work? Well, earlier I talked about foreshortening, how artists create an illusion of depth basically by showing body parts at an angle as if they're jutting out toward us. This work displays a somewhat awkward but early version of foreshortening. Clearly, the artist is trying to create an illusion of more depth by angling the arms, by overlapping the arms, and by making the lines on the beard diagonal rather than straight. Again, typical of Near Eastern art, we see the head in profile but with a frontal eye. Yet note that while the eye is frontal, the horns are not. They are shown in true profile, unlike, for example, the horns on Naram Sin. We also see that the lower body is in profile. Look at those feet marching in the same direction, and yet the upper body is squared with the shoulders facing toward us. You remember what the name is for this kind of mixed perspective? It's composite perspective. By the way, art historians tend to use the term twisted perspective for the animals we see where the heads are twisted so you see the horn, although it really is another kind of composite perspective, and it's possible that that would be the choice you would have on a multiple choice exam. So, this just goes over the points that I just made. I should have shown that slide earlier. So you recall the Assyrians, right? These are the vicious invaders that we encountered in the story of Judith and Holofernes, and indeed they feature regularly as bad guys in the Old Testament. As you'll see from this map, at its height, Assyria ruled large swaths of the Near East and Egypt as well. Wealth poured into the empire from the conquered peoples, and the Assyrians used a lot of this wealth to create commanding palaces that were designed to portray the glory of the king, the blessings of the chief god Ashur, and the havoc that Assyria would wreak on anyone who chose to oppose them. The relief images from the palace of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh are not on the required works list. They've shown up on AP exams a lot in the past, but they're not on the list this year. But the Lama Su, the guardian beasts that guarded the entrance to every Assyrian palace, are on the list. And so I want to use these relief sculptures and a video that talks about them to set the stage for the Lama Su and its role in Assyrian culture. So this is an excellent example of how a ruler used art and especially narrative to reinforce his power and claim to rule. Let's watch a brief section of an excellent video. The whole video will be up on Moodle about these relief images. By the way, an earlier portion of the video explained that Ashurbanipal was deliberately imitating the ancient story of Gilgamesh, the legendary Sumerian king who features in the first great work of narrative and religious literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh. As you'll probably guess, Gilgamesh proved his strength by fighting a lion. Again, the whole video is up and it's excellent. These statues have been a big favorite with our last two classes. Now, you saw Lama Su in the computer regeneration recreation of Ashurbanipal's palace. This king and palace date from about 100 years earlier, but they came from the same culture, and the Lama Su is a feature, as far as we know, of all Assyrian palaces. A lot of palace remains have been excavated by archaeologists. By the way, the College Board labels this work as Neo-Assyrian because there were, in fact, earlier Assyrian empires. But this was the empire that stretched the farthest, that features in the Bible, and features most prominently, for that matter, in history books. And it's the only Assyrian culture that shows up on the AP list of required works, so you don't have to keep more than one Assyrian straight, fortunately. So as we've seen, Assyrian rulers deliberately constructed their cities and palaces to showcase and reinforce their power and grandeur. The city would have included a vast complex of buildings, including several ziggurats topped with temples. This is the citadel plan for the citadel of Sargon II, where those Lamasu hang out. It is not part of the current list of required works, although it is shown up on past AP exams, and it's not totally impossible that it will be thrown at you as a surprise image. The ziggurat combined with all the elaborate courtyards are a dead giveaway, but anyway, it gives you a sense of the size of the entire complex. But now we get back to our required work. These guardian figures, or Lamasu, again, guarded the gate to the Assyrian king's palace. So anyone entering would go by these colossal statues. The Lama Su combined the bearded head of a man with the body of a lion or a bull, the wings of an eagle, and the horned headdress of a god. So, how does this work convey power and authority? And how do stylistic conventions reinforce this sense of power and authority? I want you all to talk about this, and then you'll hear from me. Okay, notice the face of Sargon and the face of the Lama Su. On the right you see, and this was actually part of the College Board image, Sargon II and his crown prince Sennacherib, who shows up quite a bit in the Bible, by the way. So the guardian figure's head is the king's head. We're seeing the king as a god, although he also presents himself in other panels as the worshiper of the chief god Ashur. This is an evolution, again, of Mesopotamian notions of political and religious authority. The figure is huge. It is a monstrous guardian. The size itself is clearly intended to provoke awe. The human head is affixed to the body of a powerful beast, symbolizing the king's superhuman strength. Both animals, as we've noted, are associated with kingship, with power, virility in ancient Near East culture and in other cultures as well. Really weird. The Lamasu has 5 legs. Why? Well, they allow us to see the features of the Lamasu from a frontal and a profile view. Again, this is art designed not to be optical, but to give maximum information and, frankly, to produce maximum effect. By giving the creature 5 legs, it creates an impression that the animal is walking toward whoever is brave enough to enter the gates, and then walks alongside anyone who has gained entry. There is no getting away from this watchful guardian. The fearsome claws, well, they underscore the ferocity of Assyrian kings, those lion slayers and enemy slayers. Remember the panel with the Elamites? And indeed, the Assyrians earned that fearsome reputation. Just check out your Old Testament. We've actually skipped over a bunch of Mesopotamian kingdoms. Sorry, but they didn't show up on the College Board list. Just remember that the region saw constant warfare and a succession of rulers and empires. Although, as we saw, the Assyrians briefly conquered Egypt, as did a few other invaders, for the most part, Egypt remained a remarkably stable empire for 15 centuries. It is to this stable, even static world that we turn now.